Alright, welcome to our lesson video for day 3.3 in geometry. We're talking about congruent triangles today, so we're going to try and get through as much of this as we can and tell you how to identify some parts of congruent triangles and what it means for triangles to be congruent. And we'll talk about a lot of that. Okay, so let's talk first about congruent triangles. Triangles with the same sides and angles, okay, same sides and angles are called congruent triangles. This means that all corresponding parts, corresponding sides and corresponding angles, have to be congruent, okay? Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, so when I say that these two triangles are congruent, we can write a congruency statement, which is this. Because these triangles are said to be congruent, I'm saying triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. The order of these letters has to match the order of these letters with corresponding parts. So like we look at the fact that angle A is marked congruent to angle D. That's why A is the first letter and D is the first letter respectively. The next set of angles would be B and E. So if I list B second in this one, I have to list E second in this one. So we have to match this order to this order according to corresponding parts. A valid congruency statement must match all corresponding angles and sides. This is important. All right? If you say something backwards, you will be kind of wrong. Okay, then last part of our definitions here, we want to talk about this acronym. There's a lot of acronyms you're going to remember in this unit, one of which is Cpctc. What is that? That is an acronym that stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Cpctc. Okay, if we know two triangles are congruent, then we know that every pair of corresponding parts is also congruent. So if we are told that a pair of triangles are congruent, we can list out the angles that are congruent and the sides that are congruent here. I don't even need the pictures to be able to do this. This congruence statement is enough. Okay, this statement right here tells me all the parts that should match up. I just look at the order. Angle J has to be congruent to angle P. Sorry, congruent to angle P. The next letter on the first one is K, so I'm going to say angle K is congruent to its corresponding angle, which is Q. And then lastly, angle L is congruent to angle R. So there's the pairs of corresponding congruent angles. But then we have sides that match up. So I'm just going to go with every two letters at a time. So JK is a segment. So I say segment JK, that's one side of that triangle. That has to match up and be congruent to segment PQ. No matter how the other triangle is turned, these two segments are congruent. Then KL is congruent to QR because of the order those fall in. And then the only other segment I haven't mentioned, JK is a segment, KL is a segment, JL is the other segment. So segment JL is congruent to segment PR. Okay? And then it asks for another valid congruency statement. That means another way of writing this, but switching the order around. So I'm going to call one triangle, instead of JKL, I'm going to say KLJ. And I'm going to say that has to be congruent to triangle, and this is where I have to see what order to write the other ones. K was congruent to angle Q, so I have to start this label with Q. L is congruent to angle R, so R has to be the next letter, which makes P the only other letter left. So when it asks for another valid congruency statement, you're just changing the order of one triangle's label and matching that order on the other side of the congruent sign. Okay? And so what I want you to do is, given that these two triangles are congruent, use the label here, this congruency statement, to first mark the triangles with their congruent corresponding parts. And I'll give you one example. Angle K must be congruent to angle A. So I'm going to mark angle K with an arc and find angle A and make the same mark. Angle P has to be congruent to angle Y, so I'm going to use a double mark for P and that same double mark for Y. And then I'm going to do a triple mark for C and M. I'll let you do that. Then we also want to mark sides congruent. And then I want to fill in these missing congruence statements. And then these last two are separate congruency statements in different versions than this. So it's kind of like we did writing this. So I want you to try to do example 2 on your own. We will check those answers together in class next time. Okay, and that leads us to the next set of our notes. So go ahead and turn the page. And we're going to talk now about how to prove that triangles are congruent. Do not get scared by this word. It says proving. We are not writing the proofs yet. But we are going to take a look at how to conclude that triangles are congruent without having to say all the sides are congruent and all of the angles are congruent, because of something called triangle rigidity. Since triangles are unique geometric figures, we can use some shortcuts. Triangle rigidity basically tells us that if I have certain angle measures and certain side lengths of a triangle, that is a fixed shape and can't be changed without causing a different triangle. And so if these shortcuts are available to us, we can use those to say the triangles are congruent. So the first one, side, side, side congruence. And it just simply states if the three sides of one triangle are congruent to three sides of the other one, even if you don't know what the angles are, the triangles still must be congruent. Okay, so we would see that marked something like this. This side congruent to its corresponding side, this one congruent to its corresponding side, and this one congruent to its corresponding side. But then we also have side angle side, which talks about two sides congruent to two other sides. So maybe like this, congruent here and congruent here, congruent here and congruent here. Sorry, there. But I don't know the third pair of sides. I don't know information about those. But the included angle, meaning the one between these two sides, is congruent to its corresponding angle between the other two sides. So this would be a side angle side congruence relationship. So that is enough to say the triangles are congruent. Angle side angle is a lot like that, but instead of two sides and one angle, we have two angles in one side. So that would be marked this way. Two angles here, congruent to their corresponding angles, and then the included side between those two angles, congruent to its corresponding side. But when we notice this, if I have two angles of one triangle congruent to two angles of another triangle, these other pairs of angles have to be congruent to each other, since all three angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. I'm not going to go through how we get there, but what that allows us to say is any two angles and a side, not necessarily the included side, so maybe this angle relationship and this angle relationship, and then still this side and this side, not included, not between the two angles. That's just another way of saying triangles are congruent there. And then we have a special case here, okay, if we have a right triangle. In right triangles only, we have a hypotenuse, okay? Any other triangle does not have a hypotenuse. You have to have a right angle to be able to have a hypotenuse. If the hypotenuse of one triangle is congruent to the hypotenuse of another, and one of the legs congruent to its corresponding leg, then we can say the triangles are congruent, and that's called HL, hypotenuse leg. These acronyms, these shortened versions of these statements, are going to be what we use to identify congruent triangles. So make sure that we understand those. So in this next example, we're going to do a few of these where we look at what has been marked for us and we try and figure out if the triangles are congruent. So we have two triangles stuck together here, which means they actually share this side. Okay? Well, anytime two triangles share that side, those sides have to be congruent to each other because they're the same segment. Okay? Well, we have right triangles. So since we have right triangles, this is the first thing I want to see if I can use. Okay? So we have both right angles here. So these two triangles share this side, which that's the hypotenuse. Okay? So these are congruent because they share a hypotenuse, and then the legs are marked congruent. So these are congruent by HL. Okay? We're going to go down to part C. Okay, you guys can try B on your own, or we'll look at that in class. I want to look at part C. On part C, we have two angles marked here, congruent, and then a pair of sides marked congruent. So we have an angle and a side, but that's all that's marked. But don't forget that vertical angles are congruent also. So we have two angles, A and A, congruent to A and A, and two sides. We just have to figure out which one is it. Well, the side marking is between the two different angle markings. So this is angle, side angle. That makes those congruent. Okay? Want to look at part E. We have angle marked congruent to angle marked congruent to angle, and angle marked congruent to angle, which would be angle, angle, angle. That is not one of our congruent statements, and so we cannot say these triangles are congruent. Even though they might be, we need more information. All right, let's go to our final page of our notes here. So we're going to do a couple examples where we are given a set of triangles and we want to show what additional information needs to be given to use the congruence that we are trying to use. Well, this one says to use side, side, side. So I have sides marked congruent here and here. UV is congruent to LV. And both triangles share segment TV, so TV has to be congruent to TV because they're the same segment. The only other pair of sides are here and here. So the needed or additional information is that UT needs to be congruent to LT or TL. That is what's missing to be able to use side, side, side. Let's look at part B. We want to use angle, angle, side. Well, the only thing marked for us are the congruent sides. Well, we also have congruent angles because they're vertical angles. So that's still not additional information. We have that. You just have to understand what the picture shows you. So the other angles that need to be congruent to use this, not angle, side, angle. Okay, not that one. I need another pair of angles that are not X or G. Because if it was X or G, that would be angle, side, angle relationship. So the other angles would be angle I congruent to angle V. That's what's missing. Okay, I want you guys to try and do part C and part D, and then we will check those answers in class along with the rest of the notes that we haven't filled out in this video.